What's going on, everyone? This is Sticks, and I want to give whoever is thinking about purchasing a Blackmagic Pocket 4K or 6K my honest opinion after owning this camera for over 2 years alongside some other cameras. I'm going to tell y'all what this camera is good at and who it is good for, and also how to add this camera into your production work if you choose to purchase this camera. This video will help you if you're thinking about jumping into a cinema camera, and what are some of the pros and the cons about this camera as far as being one of the entry-level cinema cameras in the market right now. Let's get started. One of the pros of this camera is the price. So the Blackmagic Pocket 4K comes in under $1,300, with the 6K coming under $2,000. This is one of the cheapest cinema cameras that you can get at this time. There are a few in this same area coming out. You have like Z cams, but I'll say that Blackmagic, definitely the 4K, is the cheapest cinema camera you can get at this time with 4K. Now, one of my things about this camera is you're going to most likely have to rig it out. And with this camera, the parts are not that hard to get. It uses most of your standard parts. You've already been rigging out your DSLR or mirrorless camera. A bunch of those same components will work with this camera. You may just need to make it a little more suitable for this camera, buying like extra cages and things like that. But with this camera, I think that you can build a very nice rig for under $2,500. And in the cinema world, that is very cheap. Now, a few things that you would look at when getting a rig, most likely a cage, because you want to be able to attach certain things to this camera where it's not having a hot shoe mount and things like that. You're gonna need that added to it. And then once you're shooting in these larger form files, you may need a SSD, so somewhere to mount that. It just depends on you in general. But like I say, this could be rigged out for as little as $600 upwards to $2,500. A very big pro of this camera, and why I end up purchasing it, is it had RAW built in. It also have ProRes. So for most people, RAW is something new. If you've dealt with photography and you've shot RAW versus JPEG, that's pretty much what you're getting. Most of your DSLRs and mirrorless cameras will shoot almost some type of form of H.264, 2.5, maybe even MP4. That's almost in a sense like a JPEG image in video. Oh Lord. And so with this camera, you actually have the capability of shooting RAW. It is B-RAW, so it's Blackmagic RAW. B-RAW mainly works in certain programs, doesn't work in Final Cut. You have only certain parameters you can use. Blackmagic RAW is very good, and it's good to have that capability to be able to change those things after you shot it. But there is limitations, so don't think you're getting full RAW when you get this camera. And don't worry, I'll explain a little bit more about the RAW. Also, that may be a whole nother video on its own, but I'll give you a little bit about the RAW at the end of this video. Now, with this camera, being a cinema camera, it has touchscreen. It's very great. The way the menus work, very fluid, very easy to use. There's no big learning curve. Biggest thing is, like any camera, you're learning a new menu. Like most of us, it takes a while for us to get used to the menu system. I'm actually a Canon shooter, started with Canon. Then I went over to the A7 III, learn and try to see how that camera worked. Menu system was so totally different. The same thing with this Blackmagic, but the touchscreen helps you flow around it very good. So I would say that's a pro of this camera. Another pro when thinking about jumping from a DSLR or mirrorless camera to a cinema camera like the Blackmagic is audio input. So one thing that is good about this camera is you can pick different settings of audio. You can have the left channel being in body with the right channel going to an XLR. You actually have where you can connect the XLR cable into this camera with this adapter. You have a lot more room to play with the onboard audio as far as setting levels, what's coming in, where it's coming from with this camera. And you can even turn the audio off. Another big buying point with this camera for people is the dual native ISO. A lot of people, this is new for them because a lot of the times we really don't look into what's the native ISO of our cameras. But when you're shooting RAW, that's kind of one thing that you want to know, because it gives you more dynamic range, which is more room for your image to have information in. And this camera actually has 2 native ISOs. What that means is this camera has 2 sweet spots that it shoots its highest dynamic ranges in. Plenty of people has done tests on this, and it shows that this camera has 2 areas that it has a sweet spot in. This gives you something that you can shoot in day at a very low ISO, and something that you can shoot at night and go a little higher on the ISO. You can actually see it when you jump past the 1200 mark on this camera, it actually brightens up. To bring that in full circle, most cameras like a Red has one single ISO, unless you go with their more Gemini, which is a dual native ISO camera. But most of them have one set ISO, which is like 800 most of the time, which means if you're gonna use it at its native ISO in day at 800, you're gonna have to make sure you have ND filters. This is one perk of this cinema camera that beats out some of even the higher brand cinema cameras. Now this is like one of the total reasons why you could get a cinema camera, and it could help you a lot. Record time. You no longer have that limit of DSLR mirrorless camera of only 30 minutes of recording. You actually can record as long as your memory card takes the information, or as long as it doesn't overheat. So if you're gonna shoot like longer form content, this was a great camera for my podcast. I can let it record, not having to worry about stopping it. In a production world, that may be also something you're doing. If you're doing some longer form interviews, then you're not going to want to have to be capped at a 30-minute record time. Now, this camera has so many good specs that this sounds like you should just press the buy button right now. But let me give you a few of the cons, and then you can make your decision on if you should purchase this camera or not. I'm sure the decision won't be hard after hearing it. Now, some of the cons of this camera really are not cons. For most of the people I'm talking to right now, this is for people who are trying to go from mirrorless or DSLRs into cinema. Take this as my opinion and understand that these are not always cons. These are just things that could be a little bumpy for not having all the systems in place for this camera, or just not having a team. Because remember, once you start getting into cinema production style cameras, you do have to start bringing out other people and components to make them flow a little bit. Now, one of the first things I want to start out with, we all look for, is a camera with some really good autofocus. And let me let you know, this camera does not have great autofocus, even with native lenses. We gotta remember, most of the time when you buy a cinema camera, you're gonna buy cinema lenses. None of your cinema lenses are gonna have autofocus. You're gonna have to bring out an AC to pull focus, and that's just part of the production world. For some people, this may look like that's not a con. I'm just talking to people that are usually using autofocus. I say use what works for your art style. I even use autofocus at times in certain projects. Definitely autofocus is a cripple for people that do YouTube, because when you're trying to record yourself, it's very hard to pull focus if you're not keeping a consistent distance, and that could be a major con for YouTube users. Now, the next thing I would say, this camera has a fixed LCD screen. That's kinda a bad thing, because I do love, like, one of my favorite cameras is my EOS R, which has a flip out LCD. Some of the Sonys have a flip up LCD, and this is something that's very great for when you're gonna do some vlogging and things like that. If you're thinking about this being your only camera, that could be a very hurtful situation. I did have multiple cameras. I had the Blackmagic while I still had the EOS R, and my Sony. My EOS R was more of my vlogging camera, and then when I did production work, that's when I took out the Blackmagic. It's just making sure that this camera fits into your workflow. You gotta know that a camera is only a tool for the job that you're doing. Also have to understand that one tool can't do everything. A lot of the times we're looking for the one camera that can do it all. You're gonna have to understand that that's just not gonna happen. A Philip is not gonna do a fathead's job. And that's kind of the sense of it is with cameras. So this is just one of my cons of the camera, and this is for the Blackmagic 4K, not the 6K. It's the Micro Four Threes mount. That type of sensor for me is a very small, and also the lenses are a little more niche. I'm big from full frame cameras and crop format of them. This camera, I had to readjust how I thought about things when I stepped in a room. 12mm on this camera is like 24. Now I will say, if that's a big factor for you, like it was for me, stick with the 6K Blackmagic, because it is a Super 35, which is a lot bigger. It works with EF lenses, which are a lot easier to find, and a lot of people already have them that shoot like Canons and things like that. That 6K version is a better camera to me. The build is a little bigger, and like I say, that EF mount. That's one thing to suggest when you're choosing in between these two cinema cameras. I said we would get back to the RAW, and here you go. The RAW in this camera is great if you use DaVinci Resolve. For guys who use Final Cut, the RAW is almost impossible to use. You will have to convert it either from Premiere or some type of software to turn it into a ProRes file, which to me is an extra step that just doesn't make sense. But if you're using Blackmagic RAW and you use DaVinci, then you have no problem. So if you're buying this camera and you haven't been editing, your best bet is to try to start in DaVinci. Now Premiere does use this B-RAW natively now, and it works pretty fine. There is little hiccups in it. I mean, that's Premiere. There's hiccups just in the program in general, and that's something to consider when you're buying this camera. If you're really looking for the RAW, you may have to know that you're gonna maybe use a different program to get the most out of it. Other con I have about the RAW is that it's not very good to me as far as how much you're getting in the RAW side. As far as color temperature, that's something that you can have a lot of control with. Some of the like ISO settings, adjusting like contrast and stuff. This is just me with my experience in Premiere. When you are adjusting those things, it's almost like it doesn't even work. It does something very drastic. It makes the RAW almost pointless to me, because then I'm starting to try to recreate my image again versus having a nice image and just adjusting the things that I might have missed on. So for me with this camera, I even like how the ProRes shoots and edits better. And I will say now, that's one plus of this camera, is that the ProRes does have a lot more range because it is ProRes 10-bit 422. It has a lot of give room of how you can color and adjust it, and I've got some amazing images out of this camera. So one thing also to keep in mind with this camera is if you're going to buy it, this is not a photography camera. It's not a hybrid camera. For my hybrid shooters that are used to taking a job, doing the video, and taking a couple snaps, you're not gonna be able to do that. Make sure that you keep a photography camera with you also, because you're going to have to be able to take those photos, and it's not gonna happen with this camera. There is a photo button on here. The photos are very soft. I would not recommend you take a photo with this camera. Get you a photography camera also, which you should. It just helps to have two different cameras if you're doing something. You don't wanna put all your eggs in one basket, is to say. To me, this camera is for whoever is looking to get an entry into the cinema world. Someone who wants to get used to using a cinema camera, want to slowly scale up their productions to bigger crews. The price point is very good. You can save a lot of money with this camera, thinking that you can buy this camera and rig it out for under $5 grand, with most cameras being upwards to $6,000 just starting out. And with some of that extra money could be some of the extra crew you can bring out. Now you can make sure that you're getting the best image, making sure that your lighting and set is right to make that image look better. And that's some of the things that we skip over as filmmakers, thinking that our camera is just going to do that for us. Now with that said, I hope you got information out of this video that can help you out and make a great decision with the camera that you want to go with next. And I will be doing more videos to kind of get more detail into this camera. You know, like, hey, this is how you get the best out of this camera for the people who've had this camera for a while, and for you guys that may purchase it after hearing this review. Thank you guys for watching, and if you have any questions, make sure to hit me on Instagram or Twitter and leave a comment below, and see you guys on the next one.